we would say that HS2's version of biodiversity offsetting was substantially worse than the DEFRA one. There are a series of hypothetical multipliers. And if I can just give you one example, I mean, the balance between land taken for environmental against land left in farming is that if you take a 200-metre stretch of 200 metres in length by 4 metres wide of field margin, under the HS2 multiplier for their offsetting, that 0.08 of a hectare of land will come out at 1.3 hectares. It is a remarkable increase, but that is the level of extra land take. Now, if that land take was being taken and paid for, then that would be one thing, but to have it then compulsory purchased off valuable agricultural land is quite another.
I mean, are there any areas of the HS2 metric that you'd like to particularly see changed, or do you think that, I mean, the fact that a line is taking new land over a lengthy period, is that possible to amend it, say, to be in line with what the Green Paper?
Well, I think one thing that could be changed, certainly, is a recognition that the creation of a new habitat could, in fact, be better than what you've already got. And the example for that would be if you've taken a piece of permanent pasture and replaced it with a flower-enhanced meadow, that might be better habitat than you had before.
I'll just come in there a moment. One particular concern for CPRE, or two rather, are hedgerows and verges of lanes, two very much iconic parts of the English countryside. Now, the way HS2, there was the DEFRA and the HS2 metric, seems to assess those is simply in terms of their total area. Now, verges and also hedges are key for connectivity of wildlife. Imagine if you assess the connectivity between the north and London of HS2 by simply how big an area the railway took. That would be clearly ridiculous. But similarly, the same principle is being used to look at the biodiversity value of hedges and countryside verges. That cannot be right.
Surely the natural ecosystem assessment tool should be used to establish a true natural capital of those wildlife corridors, in keeping with what the white paper said about the value of such land. It's over and above the metric that is proposed here. Surely it should be applied to such sensitive green space.
Well, it should, but unfortunately the technical appendix seems to give transport corridors the same value, whatever they are, whether it's a motorway or a country lane. Now, of course, there are some fantastic schemes planting wildflowers along motorway verges, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're as great for all different species as a country lane.
Well, I mean, I take it from what you're saying that as it stands at the moment, you would consider that the supposed iterative process wouldn't be capable of delivering that qualitative offsetting without other mechanisms being added which would enable that to happen. Or do you think that's just an impossible way of proceeding in terms of what's being put forward?
I think there's scope to change it. The problem is with the timetable, we haven't really had the results from the pilots yet. Trying to rush ahead with the bill, still even 2016 is quite a tight timetable given the scale of this. Is it really going to be possible to learn from the pilots, discuss them and then feed that into the bill, or will things have proceeded too far by then?
Right. But I mean, we've already got the note that I think on the environmental statement that 89 local wildlife sites will be affected, and 61 of those, the result will have significant adverse impact on the very integrity of the site. So, bearing that in mind, what would your view be of how any sort of mitigation hierarchy then might be properly applied? I mean, particularly the fact that 2/3 of those sites will have their fundamental integrity compromised.
Well, one of the issues is that HS2 haven't actually fully published their methodology or calculations yet. They promised us, the ES states that they'd make this available to relevant parties, but this hasn't yet happened. And on some of those circumstances of these sites, they haven't actually gone in and assessed the actual sites, so they can't really state what the damage will be and what the mitigation or compensation for any residual damage will be. One of the constraints, I think, also is that it's being put in the construction boundary, and the laudable aims of the white paper in terms of the connectivity and the wider landscape resilience can't really be done if you're looking just at the red line construction boundary, and that also then squeezes the compensation land onto sites of high grade value, which again we wouldn't want to be seeing. It's about looking at the wider landscape connectivity, and I think that opportunity has been missed.
I think the whole point about that part of the consultation is it hasn't been consulted on, it's untried, it's untested, and frankly it isn't at all clear.
It's quite damning. It's quite damning.
Yes. It was meant to be, Madam Chairman.
One problem with the mitigation hierarchy is that it's very difficult to see whether our HS2 has reasonably been unable to avoid or mitigate damage, because they've often said, well, that's too expensive to make the change, a point made in the previous session. CPRE has requested that they disclose the cost of all the amendments that they've refused on cost grounds, but we were told disclosing that would be manifestly unreasonable and not in the public interest. The cost of then having to go through their files would be about £4,000. Perhaps the committee could make a request of HS2 Limited that it discloses the cost, because I would submit that is in the public interest to know where they have said we can't protect the environment because of cost reasons.
Similarly, with option appraisals for some of the more major impacts, where there have been suggestions for alternatives, such as the Chilterns Tunnel, which would save a third of the ancient woodland threat along the route. All we've been told is there are engineering reasons why it can't happen, but there's not the detail. We have been told we'll get that detail, but that should have been in the environmental statement, where there was an option appraisal of the different scenarios and the relative pros and cons of those scenarios evaluated, and the reason for the decision they've come up with stated.
The environmental statement appears to make a distinction between mitigation and compensation for residual biodiversity loss and offsetting enhancements. Do you think the environmental statement is sufficiently clear about the differences between these and how each of them should be used?
Unfortunately, we don't think it is particularly clear, and it's also differing between different CFA reports, the individual reports on the areas. Sometimes they blur the lines between mitigation and compensation, and we found that going through each of the area reports, they differ. I mean, it's clear that there's different authors for each of those, so there's not consistency across the report. And yes, the idea is that you mitigate, you avoid or reduce harm, and then you try and compensate. One of the tools for compensation is offsetting. It's not the only one. Now, as I say, from our perspective at the Woodland Trust, ancient woodland, you can't offset it. And so we would be wanting to avoid damage. That's really the only option we can see for those. And that's why things such as the Chilterns Tunnel, we don't know why that hasn't been considered, and we haven't seen the evaluation of why that's not been considered.
So you very good illustration there that the difference between the differentiation between like-for-like compensation, which is simply not possible in some of the lost green space, and the alternative of dissimilar compensation. But what measures should be put in place for like-for-like replacement where it is possible?
I think that should be incorporated in there, and again using the Natural Environment White Paper's principles of looking for maximising the use of the surrounding landscape, and certainly not just in the narrow corridor. That's one of the principles of biodiversity offsetting, is that you do like for like, and you don't sort of destroy an area of wetland and create a grassland as a result. You should try and compensate in a like manner.
Absolutely. I'm sure that
Well,
Henry will have a view.
the CLA has been very supportive of the concept and the principle behind biodiversity offsetting for a very long time. But and two of the other extremely influential groups, Dieter Helm at the Natural Capital Committee, Ian Cheshire at the Ecosystems Market Task Force, have also had it very high on their list of very good things to look at. But neither of them were looking at the being paid for by compulsory purchase of land. And that is the bit which is, frankly, iniquitous in the whole process. So if there was a long-term income for the landowner for providing the environmental goods that are required, then that would be understandable. But to take a parcel of land and compulsory purchase it from him, and then not even be in the state where you have to then pass it back to him if it's taken under temporary work, is, I cannot find a better word than iniquitous.
I think there are problems that the Law Commission has produced a report on environmental covenants, but they're not likely to come in to be able to be used until, let's say, 2016 if things move quickly. So there is a legal tool missing, and that does mean some delivery problems.
Just two further points. I think one of the issues is that the environmental statement often doesn't consider the time frame between the destruction of a habitat and the compensation maturing, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
And for instance, in the BAT report that's been commissioned and the evidence from the BAT Conservation Trust, that just shows that, for instance, in the case of woodland-dependent species such as Beckstein's bat, you will lose them. The damage will be irreparable. Then they will have nowhere to go for 15 to 20 years. And that's an example of where the temporal aspects aren't taken into account. And I would also agree with Rafe about the conservation covenants. There's no mechanism identified in the environmental statement. I think it was covered in the previous session as well, about the management, monitoring, and what to do if things don't go exactly to plan. What intervention would be necessary, and therefore what funding would there be for that in terms of a mitigation fund beyond the construction phase of HS2.
You've anticipated almost one of our later questions there, but I think you've made clear who you think should be responsible, or would you just like to say who you think should be responsible for managing these new offset sites? And to make sure that the delivery is genuinely of the environmental value we would expect through the process.
Well, I think the sites would need management plans and a commitment to funding of that management, including any intervention and the monitoring. Other mechanisms where we've seen this happen is with a large endowment fund that allows where the interest from that is used to do the maintenance and monitoring and any intervention. But obviously there is a cost allied to that. In terms of an organisation, we're not suggesting any particular organisation, but there need to be criteria that whichever organisation it does undertake that it does have a commitment, a legal and financially binding commitment to do the work that's been laid out.
I think going back to High Speed 1, then the Channel Tunnel Rail Link, having looked at CPRE's archives, we complained alongside the Kent Wildlife Trust that there's only money for around 10 or 12 years after opening provided to maintain environmental features. We would say that this time around there should be funding for 120 years, the lifetime of the infrastructure. Who knows what will happen during that time? Perhaps another form of disease will wipe out certain tree species. There needs to be enough money to keep those environmental features working for the lifetime of the project.
Do you think that ancient woodland should be considered? Oh, sorry, I've lost my phone. Do you think ancient woodland should be included within the compensation metric?
The difficulty is ancient woodland in or out of biodiversity offsetting? I think we're clear that you can't offset. So if you take that principle, which is what the DEFRA paper has said, and there was your own report concluded similar, the same thing. Is then in the event of ancient woodland being residual damage to ancient woodland, what do you do about that? and the paper suggests a bespoke scheme. I think what we're suggesting is any bespoke scheme should use the highest possible metrics as the starting point for any compensation, and that again it uses the connectivity. I'm sorry to keep talking about it, but the what we call the Lawton principles of connectivity at a landscape scale, and that's the only way if there is any residual damage. But again, we would hope there's as little damage as possible by other measures such as the Chiltern Tunnel, changes to route that avoid the ancient woodland.